They thought he was just the janitor, until he interrupted a $300 million meeting, speaking fluent Japanese, then German, then Arabic, then Mandarin. The billionaire at the head of the table? Speechless. What happened next didn't just change one man's life. It shook the entire company to its core. This is the story of Carlos, and how 9 languages led him from a mop to the boardroom. Billionaire hears janitor speak 9 languages. What he does next leaves the whole office stunned. Before we go further, please ensure to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories like this one. In a towering skyscraper nestled in the heart of New York City, brilliance passed through revolving glass doors every single day. Suits pressed sharp as razors. Lattes always hot, phones always ringing. This was the headquarters of Grant Enterprises, home to innovation, influence, and the man who ruled it all, Alexander Grant. To the world, he was a titan, a self-made billionaire. Tech visionary, a man whose time was more valuable than gold. But inside his glass fortress, he was just another figure in a tailored suit, feared, admired, and always moving forward. And then, there was Carlos. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, Carlos would slip through the side entrance, gray uniform neat, boots worn, hands calloused from years of labor. No one looked up when he passed. No one paused when he mopped their path or wiped fingerprints from their marble desks. To them, he was invisible, a shadow in the hallway. But Carlos was watching, listening. Every conversation, every complaint, every careless word tossed across the office floor as if he weren't there. He absorbed it all in silence. On lunch breaks, when the others scrolled their phones or gossiped by the vending machine, Carlos would sit alone, a tattered book in his hand, its spine cracked, its title in French, or maybe Mandarin. He would murmur words under his breath in languages no one around him understood, and that was just fine by him. You see, Carlos had once been someone else, somewhere far away, in a life that seemed too distant to be real. But here, he was just the janitor, and he had accepted that until the day everything changed. It started on a Wednesday, the kind of Wednesday that looked like all the rest: gray skies, stale air, and the low hum of ambition vibrating through the 33rd floor. But down in the lower levels, something was brewing. A meeting was set to take place that evening, one that would bring in investors from all over the world. Japanese, German, Moroccan, Russian, Brazilian. They were here to decide whether or not to invest $300 million in Alexander Grant's next big project, a global AI expansion. But there was one flaw in the plan. Alexander, brilliant as he was, didn't speak more than 2 languages. And his usual interpreter? Sick. No backup. No notice. No solution. Tension built fast. And somewhere down the hallway, quietly pushing a mop past a polished chrome door, was Carlos. He heard the raised voices. He heard the struggle. And then he heard something that made him pause. A Japanese investor trying to explain his concerns, frustrated, unheard. A German executive tapping her finger, irritated. A Brazilian guest scrolling his phone, already losing interest. Carlos looked around. No one else was coming. No one else was even aware. He put the mop aside, straightened his back, took a breath, and stepped into the boardroom. No one turned at first. They didn't expect him to speak. Why would they? But when Carlos opened his mouth and began to translate, first in clean, precise Japanese, the room froze. The billionaire turned, and everything changed. No one turned at first. They didn't expect him to speak. Why would they? But when Carlos opened his mouth and began to translate, first in clean, precise Japanese, the room froze. He bowed slightly, a gesture of cultural respect, then looked toward the Japanese businessman and calmly repeated the investor's concern in English. Alexander, who had just moments before been clutching his tablet in frustration, slowly turned toward the janitor. He raised a brow, unsure if what he heard was real. Before anyone could question it, the German delegate added something in his native tongue. Without missing a beat, Carlos responded in fluent German, even adjusting his accent to the man's region. Eyes widened. A few jaws dropped. The Russian investor tested him next, half curious, half skeptical. Carlos answered fluidly. Then came French. Then Portuguese. Then Arabic. Each time, Carlos transitioned like flipping pages in a well-read book. The billionaire said nothing at first. He merely watched. His meeting, once chaotic and unraveling, was now back on track. And it wasn't because of technology or expensive consultants. It was because of the janitor. As Carlos spoke, the tension melted from the room. The investors were now smiling, nodding, engaging, not just with Alexander, but with each other. Carlos didn't just translate words. He conveyed tone, culture, intent. He brought clarity. And perhaps most importantly, he brought credibility. When the final signature hit the last page of the agreement, the meeting officially concluded. Applause broke out. Not loud, but sincere. The delegates stood, shaking hands, exchanging cards. Carlos stepped back, ready to return to his card in the hallway. That's when Alexander raised a hand. Wait, he said. Carlos stopped, slowly turned. Don't go, the billionaire added. I want to talk to you. Alone. Carlos stood near the conference table, quietly. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, they held something deeper, a calm that comes from years of endurance. Alexander Grant walked toward him, hands in his pockets. His voice was lower now, more personal. You just saved a deal worth over $300 million. You know that, right? Carlos gave a small nod. I'm glad I could help. Alexander tilted his head, still sizing him up. How many languages was that? Carlos thought for a moment. 9, comfortably. A few more conversationally. There was a pause. You're a janitor, Alexander said, not with insult, just disbelief. Carlos smiled faintly. That's what the badge says. And yet you speak 9 languages. Carlos met his gaze. Some people lift weights to stay sharp. I study. By the next morning, the entire 33rd floor had heard about what happened. The janitor? Fluent in Japanese? I heard he corrected the French guy's grammar. Why is someone like that sweeping floors? Rumors spun fast. People who once brushed past Carlos without a glance were now offering awkward hellos. A few even tried to spark conversation in foreign languages, hoping to catch a glimpse of the magic. But the truth? The truth was more complex than anyone could guess. And Alexander Grant, he wasn't letting this go. Not yet. By Thursday morning, Carlos was no longer just the janitor. He was the question everyone whispered about at their desks, the name that echoed in break rooms, and the story that seemed too strange to be true. Did you see the video? Someone asked near the coffee machine. A shaky cell phone recording, taken by one of the assistants during the investor meeting, had made its way around. It showed Carlos at the front of the boardroom, speaking 5 different languages in under 2 minutes. The video didn't capture everything, but it was enough to cause a stir. Some were amazed. Others were embarrassed. People who had mocked his quietness, mimicked his accent behind his back, or simply pretended he didn't exist were now realizing they'd misjudged him. Severely. Even HR was uneasy. Months ago, Carlos had applied for a junior administrative role, one far above janitorial work, but still beneath his actual qualifications. He was turned down, not for lack of skill, but because of lack of corporate experience in the U.S. Now, those same decision-makers were reviewing his application again quietly, and with guilt. Alexander sat at his desk, a tablet in one hand, Carlos's employee file open in front of him. It was shockingly thin. Name, Carlos Mendoza. Position, Facilities Support Technician. Languages, English, Spanish. Hire date, 2 years ago. There was no mention of his other language skills. No prior education. No resume. Just a simple application, completed by hand, with a New York address and a humble signature. Who are you really? Alexander muttered. He tapped a few keys, pulling up internal security footage, not to spy, but to study. There was Carlos, sweeping late at night, pausing occasionally to read worn books in the break room. Each book was in a different language: French poetry, Russian literature, Arabic philosophy. There was even a book in Sanskrit. Alexander leaned back, eyes narrowing. People like this don't just land in janitor roles by accident. He picked up the phone. Olivia, he said to his assistant, I need a background check. Quietly. On Carlos Mendoza. Pull everything you can find. Start with international academic records. Carlos felt the shift. Not in the air, but in the eyes. People watched him now. Smiled more. Spoke to him, sometimes awkwardly, trying to be polite. But he knew what it was. Curiosity. For years, he had gone unnoticed. Now, he was suddenly interesting not because of who he was, but because of what he'd revealed. Not everyone meant harm, but few meant understanding either. He kept his routine. Swept the floors. Cleaned the glass. Replaced the paper towels. But inside, something had changed. He had once stood in front of hundreds, lecturing on linguistics and cultural evolution. His passion wasn't just languages, it was bridges. The invisible threads that connected humanity through words, sound, and meaning. He had written papers, spoken at global conferences. He had shaken hands with diplomats and debated syntax with scholars. And then, like a building struck at the foundation, it all crumbled. His wife became ill. The treatment wasn't available in their country. The costs were beyond reach. He left his career, sold what he could, and moved to the United States with hope. But hope, he discovered, didn't translate well across borders. His qualifications weren't recognized. His savings vanished. And when his wife passed 2 years later, Carlos was left with only one mission: provide for his daughter. He took the job that no one else wanted. Not because it was beneath him, but because it was immediate. It was steady, and it was honest. He never complained. He just worked. Alexander opened the file slowly. There it was. Carlos Mendoza, Ph.D. in linguistics from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Published author. Former guest lecturer at the University of Tokyo, the Sorbonne in Paris, and King Saud University in Riyadh. Trained in over a dozen languages. Fluent in 9. Documented interpreter in global peace talks. 15 years ago. Alexander closed the folder, exhaled slowly, and stared at the skyline. This wasn't just a man with skills. This was a scholar. A survivor. Someone his entire company had overlooked. Carlos stood just outside the glass door, cleaning cloth in hand, about to move on. "Carlos," came a voice from within. He turned. Alexander Grant stood at his desk, sleeves rolled up, a file folder open beside him. "Come in," he said. Carlos hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. "Sit," Alexander offered, pointing to the chair across from him. Carlos sat slowly. He didn't speak. Alexander tapped the folder once, then looked up. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked. Carlos blinked. "About what?" "The languages. The Ph.D. The published papers. The lectures. The fact that you were once a man whose words shaped policy in 3 continents." Carlos exhaled softly. "I didn't think it mattered," he said simply. Alexander leaned forward. "You didn't think it mattered? In this building? To this company?" Carlos smiled, not sarcastic, but sad. "People here see uniforms, not lives. Degrees don't clean floors. Resumes don't change light bulbs." There was a silence between them. Then Carlos continued. "When my wife got sick, I did what any husband would do. I left my post. I sold our apartment in Madrid. I brought her here for treatment, but insurance didn't cover it. And she didn't make it." Alexander's jaw clenched subtly. "I had a 5-year-old daughter," Carlos added, his voice quiet but steady. "She needed food, shelter, stability. I applied for over 200 jobs. Each interview ended the same. You're brilliant, but we can't validate your credentials. No U.S. experience. No references here. Eventually, someone offered me this job. Janitorial. I took it." Alexander leaned back, eyes on the ceiling for a second before returning to Carlos. "And you've just been working in the shadows ever since?" Carlos nodded. Quietly, but not bitterly. "I made peace with it. I still read, still practice, still learn. Language is like breath to me. I couldn't stop if I tried." Alexander looked at him for a long moment, then said, "What you did in that meeting, no tech, no AI, no amount of corporate polish could have matched it. You brought those people together with your voice." Carlos offered a faint, appreciative nod. "I didn't do it for the company," he said honestly. "I did it because communication matters, even when no one's listening." Alexander stood, walked around the desk, and sat on the edge of it. "You're right," he said. "People see uniforms. They don't see stories. That's on me. That's on all of us." He paused. "I'm offering you a new role. Officially. I want you to head our global relations division. Lead language services, build cultural bridges. Name your salary. I'll clear the path, no red tape, no HR blockades." Carlos was silent for a moment, absorbing the words. Then he asked, "Why?" Alexander didn't miss a beat. "Because you're the most qualified person I've ever met. And because it's time people like you stopped getting overlooked." Carlos looked down, then back up. "I'll do it," he said. "But not for the title. Not for the money." He stood. "I'll do it because someone needs to remind this place and this world that greatness doesn't always come wearing a suit." Alexander smiled, for the first time in days. That, he said, is the smartest thing anyone said in this office all year. Carlos walked in, not in a janitor's uniform, but a navy blue suit. Simple, sharp, confident. No mop, no cart, just a folder tucked under his arm and a calm fire in his eyes. People turned as he passed. Some clapped. Some looked down, ashamed of their past behavior. Others just stared, still trying to process the transformation. But Carlos didn't walk in with arrogance. He walked in with purpose. And every step he took reminded them that the man they had ignored for years had more dignity than most ever would. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Carlos stepped out, but he wasn't wearing gray today. He wore navy blue, custom-tailored, modest but refined. His shoes were polished, his posture tall, and as he walked, there was no hesitation in his stride. For the first time in years, people moved aside to make room for him, not because he was in their way, but because now, he belonged in their space. The receptionist nearly stood to greet him, stammering, "Dr. Mendoza. Carlos." Sir." Carlos smiled kindly. "Carlos is fine. I'm still the same man." But everyone could see he wasn't. Not entirely. Alexander Grant stood at the front, his presence commanding as always. But today, his tone was different. "We talk about innovation," he began, "about pushing boundaries. But we almost missed the most extraordinary mind in this building because we were too busy looking over him." He gestured toward Carlos, now seated among the department heads. "Carlos Mendoza is no longer our janitor. He is now our head of global relations. Fluent in 9 languages, trained across continents, and one of the most insightful communicators I've ever met." He paused. To the staff who overlooked him, learn from this. And to those who laughed, ignored, dismissed, ask yourselves why. The room was silent, not out of fear, but realization. Carlos stood, calm as ever. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't need to. He just said, "Language is more than words. It's respect." And for years, I listened to a lot of words here, but heard very little of that. I'm here now, and I hope, not just to speak, but to help us finally listen. And with that, he sat down. But no one saw him the same way again. Photos lined his shelf, his daughter at graduation, his wife smiling beneath cherry blossoms, a chalkboard filled with phonetic symbols and language trees. A knock at the door. It was Mia, from HR, the same manager who had once rejected his application. "Carlos," she began awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For not seeing." Carlos raised a hand gently. "Don't worry," he said. "You weren't supposed to see. I was invisible by design." She looked confused. "I hid," he added. "Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't ready. But that's the thing about language. You speak it when the world needs to hear it. Not before." She nodded and left, quieter than she came. Teaching executives how to greet a Saudi partner properly. Helping design translation systems for AI ethics discussions. Mediating a cultural misunderstanding between teams in New York and Nairobi. Bit by bit, the company transformed. And at the heart of it all was a man who once scrubbed their floors. Carlos smiles, noticing the nervous posture. "First week." The young man nods. "Yeah." Carlos extends his hand. "Carlos Mendoza. Welcome aboard." The young man's eyes widen. "Wait, you're the Carlos chuckles. I used to wear your uniform." "You'll do just fine." The elevator dings. They part ways. But the smile stayed with the young man the rest of the day. The wind blew softly. Cars buzzed far below. A familiar old book rested in his hand. In Arabic, this time. His phone buzzed. A video message, his daughter, speaking French, thanking him for everything. He smiled, closed the book, looked out. He hadn't just changed departments. He hadn't just changed titles. He'd reminded an empire that brilliance can wear any face. That genius doesn't shout. It listens. It endures. And when the moment is right, it speaks. Carlos was never just the janitor. He was a man with a library in his mind and silence in his shoes. And when the world finally listened, he gave it something worth hearing. How many brilliant minds do we pass by every day, simply because they don't wear a title? Carlos didn't need a promotion to prove his worth. He just needed someone to notice. In a world that often looks for greatness at the top, this story reminds us, sometimes, it's been sweeping the floors all along. If this story moved you, share it. Let someone out there know that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy. Never judge a person by their uniform. True value speaks for itself. Subscribe for more real stories that inspire.